The air in the Grand Royal Hotel lobby was thick with the scent of money. It wasn't a bad smell, not really. It was a mix of expensive perfume, the faint, sweet aroma of champagne bubbling in delicate flutes, and the clean, crisp scent of fresh lilies arranged in towering silver vases. Light from a dozen massive chandeliers spilled down, making every polished surface, the marble floors, the brass railings, the gleaming wood of the reception desk shimmer like it was alive. This was a world of soft laughter, clinking glasses, and the low, confident hum of people who were used to being noticed. Julian Croft was right at home in this world. He moved through the crowd with an easy grace, a glass of something amber and expensive in his hand. He wasn't just a guest. He was a fixture. His name was on the donor list for nearly every major art institution in the city, and his opinion could make or break an artist's career. He had an eye for quality, he told himself, and a nose for pretense. As he nodded to an acquaintance, a man in a perfectly tailored suit, his eyes were already scanning the room, assessing, judging. He appreciated the fine details, the way the bartender twisted a lemon peel, the cut of a woman's dress, the subtle brushstrokes on a painting hung discreetly in a corner. To Julian, life was a gallery, and only a few things were worthy of being hung on the wall. In the center of this grand space, like a king on its throne, sat a grand piano. It was a Steinway, black and gleaming under the chandelier lights. Its lid was propped open, revealing the intricate web of strings and hammers inside. It wasn't just an instrument. It was a statement, a promise of the beautiful music that would be played later that evening. Julian gave it an approving glance. It was exactly the kind of tasteful, impressive centerpiece a gala like this needed. It was art, it was status, and it was expensive. Everything that mattered. And then he saw her. She was a smudge on the perfect picture. A young woman, probably in her late 20s, dressed in the plain, dark uniform of the hotel cleaning staff. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face was free of any makeup. She moved quietly, almost invisibly, with a soft cloth in her hand, meticulously polishing the long brass railing that bordered the main staircase. She worked with a focused intensity, her head bent, her movements economical and precise. She was so much a part of the background that people walked right past her without a second glance, their conversations flowing around her like a river around a stone. She was, in every sense of the word, a nobody in this world of some bodies. Julian watched her for a moment, a slight frown creasing his forehead. It wasn't that she was doing anything wrong. In fact, she was doing her job perfectly. That was the problem, in a way. She was so functional, so utilitarian. She existed to serve, to clean, to erase the fingerprints of the important people. She had no place in the world of beauty and art he curated in his mind. He turned back to his companion, a woman dripping with jewels, and made a quiet, dismissive comment about the service staff being so visible tonight. They both shared a small, knowing laugh, and just like that, the woman was forgotten again, but she wasn't invisible to herself. Ilara felt the eyes on her, even if they were just a fleeting glance of dismissal. She was used to it. She had learned early on that the best way to get through her shift was to become a ghost. She focused on her work, on the satisfying feel of the brass becoming warm and shiny under her cloth. She focused on the rhythm of her breathing, in and out, a silent mantra that kept her centered in a world that felt so far away from her own. She heard the snatches of conversation about art auctions and summer homes in the Hamptons, and she let them wash over her like a distant tide. This was her job. This was her life. And in a few hours, she would clock out and disappear back into the city, just another face in the crowd. After finishing the railing, she moved on to her next task, which took her closer to the center of the lobby. She had to clean the glass panels of the doors leading out to the garden terrace. As she worked, she found herself standing right beside the grand piano. It was so much bigger up close. It seemed to have its own gravity, its own presence. The black lacquer was so deep it looked like you could fall into it. The white keys seemed to glow, promising something magical. Lara stopped. Her cloth hung limply in her hand. She was done with the doors, but she couldn't bring herself to move away. She had always loved the piano. As a little girl, she had saved up for months to buy a cheap second-hand keyboard. She would spend hours in her room, teaching herself songs from the radio, her fingers stumbling over the plastic keys. It was the one thing that had ever felt truly hers. But life, as it so often does, had gotten in the way. Responsibilities had piled up, and the music had slowly faded into a quiet memory now. Standing here, she felt that old pull, that familiar ache in her chest. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out with her free hand. She didn't dare touch the keys. Not really. She just let her fingers hover a few millimeters above them, tracing the invisible shapes of chords she used to know. Her eyes were closed, and for a brief, fleeting moment, she wasn't a cleaner in a fancy hotel. She was just a girl who loved music, standing before a beautiful instrument, lost in a silent, secret prayer. From across the room, Julian Croft happened to glance back in her direction. He saw her standing there, her hand poised over the piano, her eyes closed with a look on her face that he couldn't quite place. He saw the plain uniform, the simple ponytail, the way she seemed to be pretending to be something she wasn't. A wave of annoyance, sharp and cold, washed over him. It was almost insulting. To him, she was mocking the instrument, mocking the art. With her little daydream, he leaned towards his friend, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He kept his voice low, but the bite in his words was clear. "Look at her," he whispered, nodding in Alara's direction. "Honestly, it's like she thinks she's in a movie. People like that don't even know what to do with an instrument like that. It's just a piece of furniture to her." His friend followed his gaze and giggled, turning away without a second thought. For them, it was just a momentary amusement, a small, cruel joke to pass the time. For Julian, it was a simple statement of fact, a clear division between the people who mattered and the people who didn't. He was so sure of his world, so certain of his place in it, that he had no idea he had just judged a book by its cover. Without ever stopping to consider the story written inside, he turned away, already forgetting the quiet woman by the piano, his mind moving on to the next thing, the next person, the next piece of art that was worthy of his attention. The clock on the lobby wall seemed to be ticking louder than usual. Each second was a little hammer blow, nudging the evening closer to disaster. The initial buzz of excited anticipation had curdled into a nervous, agitated energy. Guests were still arriving, their smiles a little tight, their greetings a little too quick. They could all feel it, like a change in air pressure before a storm. Something was wrong. The source of the storm was the hotel manager, a man named Mr. Allister, who was pacing a frantic track behind the reception desk. His usually perfectly combed hair was starting to come undone, a stray strand falling across his sweaty forehead. He had a phone pressed to his ear, but the conversation was entirely one-sided. "No, I understand he's unwell, but yes, of course, his health is the priority. But is there anyone? A student, an accompanist, anyone at all?" He listened for a moment, his face falling with every second that passed. "Thank you for your time." He hung up the phone, with a defeated clatter that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet lobby, the world-renowned pianist. The main attraction, the reason half the city's elite had bought expensive tickets for this charity gala, had taken violently ill just an hour before he was due to perform. A sudden, severe case of food poisoning, the doctor on the phone had said. There was no chance he would be playing. Mr. Allister felt like the floor was about to give way beneath him. This wasn't just a disappointment. It was a catastrophe. The Grand Royale Hotel's reputation was on the line, and more importantly, a great deal of money for a children's hospital was about to be lost. Julian. Croft watched the manager's meltdown with a growing sense of irritation. This was not the refined, elegant evening he had been promised. He was standing near the grand piano, which now looked less like a throne and more like a tombstone. Its silence was a heavy blanket, smothering the party. He saw Mr. Allister make another call, his voice pleading. This was getting pathetic. Julian, a man who believed problems existed to be solved, decided to take matters into his own hands. He strode over to the desk, his movements sharp and purposeful. "Allister," he said, his voice cutting through the manager's panic. "This is unacceptable." Who are you calling? Mr. Allister looked up, his eyes wide with desperation. Mr. Croft, I'm trying everyone. The conservatory, the local symphony, even a few jazz clubs I know. It's too short notice. Everyone is already booked. Julian scoffed, a sound of pure impatience. Nonsense. You're calling the wrong people. Let me make some calls. He pulled out his own phone, a sleek, expensive device. He didn't have numbers for musicians in his contact list, but he had numbers for people who knew people. He paced as he spoke, his voice low and commanding. It's Julian Croft. Yes, I'm fine. Listen, I have a situation. I need a pianist now. At the Grand Royale. What do you mean, who? I don't care. A good one. Someone who can handle a Rachmaninoff concerto? No, I don't have their music. Just find someone. He hung up, scowling. His calls were just as fruitless. The world of professional musicians was a tightly scheduled machine, and you couldn't just insert a new part at the last minute. While the drama unfolded, Alara continued her work. She was on her hands and knees now, carefully scrubbing a small scuff mark from the pristine white marble near the base of the piano. She was so close she could smell the faint, woody scent of the instrument's polish. She could hear every word. Mr. Allister's panicked voice, Julian's arrogant, demanding tone, the guests' confused whispers. She felt like she was in a bubble. The rest of the world fading away until all that existed was the silent piano and the desperate need for someone to make it sing. She finished with the scuff mark and stood up, her back aching slightly. She looked at the keys, so close, so silent. They were just ivory and wood, but to her, they were a universe of possibilities. A universe she had locked away years ago. She remembered the feeling of her fingers on the keys, the way the music would flow through her, carrying away all the worries and fears of the world. She remembered the joy, the escape, and she remembered the pain of letting it go. The memory was a sharp, sudden ache in her chest. Mr. Allister had slumped against the desk, his head in his hands. He was muttering to himself now, a man talking to his own personal god of despair. The guests are seated. The program is printed. The donations. Oh, the donations. He looked up, his eyes scanning the lobby as if searching for a miracle. His gaze fell upon the silent piano, and he let out a long, shuddering sigh. He spoke to the empty air, his voice barely a whisper, but in the tense quiet of the lobby it carried. I'd give anything, he breathed, the words full of a bone-deep weariness. I'd give anything for anyone who could just play something. Anything. The words hung in the air. Anyone, anything. They hit Alara like a physical blow. It was an open door. A desperate, last-chance plea that had nothing to do with status or reputation or connections. It was a simple, human cry for help. And it was directed at the universe. At anyone who was listening, her heart started to pound, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. A voice in her head, a voice that sounded a lot like her own fear, screamed at her, "Don't you dare. You'll make a fool of yourself. You're a cleaner. You haven't played seriously in years. Your hands are rough from work. They'll laugh you out of the room. You'll lose your job." But another voice, a quieter, stronger voice that had been buried under years of practicality and sacrifice, began to whisper back, "But what if you don't? What if this is the one chance you'll ever get? That piano is right there. It's silent. It's waiting." He said anyone. He said anything. That means you. She looked at her hands. They were clean, but they were the hands of a worker. The nails were short and unpolished. There were calluses on her palms from gripping mop handles and cleaning buckets. They were not the hands of a concert pianist, but they were her hands. And they remembered. She thought of her mother, of the long, sleepless nights she had sat by her bed. She thought of the cheap keyboard she had sold to pay for medicine. She thought of the silent years that followed, the years of work and survival, of pushing the dream down so deep she almost forgot it was there. All that sacrifice, all that pain, had brought her to this moment, standing in the most beautiful room she had ever seen, next to the most beautiful piano she had ever touched. With a man begging for anyone to play, the fear was still there, a cold, knot in her stomach. But something else was rising up to meet it. A feeling so powerful and unfamiliar, it took her a moment to recognize it. It was courage. Not the loud, boisterous courage of a soldier, but the quiet, stubborn courage of a person who has nothing left to lose in a dream worth fighting for. The guests were beginning to murmur more loudly, their impatience growing. Julian was glaring at his phone, as if he could intimidate a musician into appearing. Mr. Allister looked like he was about to faint. The silence from the piano was becoming unbearable, and in the middle of it all, Alara took a single quiet step forward. It was the smallest step in the world, but for her, it felt like leaping across a canyon. She was no longer a ghost. She was no longer part of the scenery. She was a person with a decision to make. And as she took another step, her eyes fixed on the empty bench, the quiet, stubborn voice in her head grew louder until it was the only thing she could hear. Play. Just play. The first step was the hardest. It felt like she was lifting a weight far heavier than her own body. The polished marble floor seemed to stretch for miles, a vast, empty expanse between her old life and whatever was waiting at that piano. Every eye in the lobby was on her, but it wasn't the kind of attention she had ever wanted. It was the sharp, curious stare of a crowd that has just seen a glitch in the program. A low murmur started, like a swarm of bees, and it followed her as she walked. Words like, "What's she doing?" "And is this part of the show?" drifted through the air, but they sounded distant, muffled, as if she were underwater. Her focus was narrow. A tunnel vision that had only one object at its end, the smooth black bench of the Steinway. She didn't look at the faces in the crowd. She couldn't. If she saw the confusion, the pity, or the scorn in their eyes, the courage she had scraped together would crumble into dust. She just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, her cleaning uniform feeling rough and scratchy against her skin, a constant reminder of who they thought she was. Julian Croft was the first to react with true anger. He saw her moving towards the stage, and a hot flush of indignation rose in his chest. This was no longer a pathetic situation. It was an insult. It was a mockery of the art he cherished, of the money he had donated, of the very order of the world. To him, she was a symbol of chaos, a person who didn't know her place, stepping into a spotlight she had no right to. He put his glass down on a nearby table with a sharp click, his mind already formulating the plan. He would give her a withering look, a single cold glare that would send her scurrying back to the shadows. If that didn't work, he would simply signal for security. He would have her removed quietly and efficiently, and the evening could get back on track. He was a problem solver, and this woman was a problem that needed to be solved. But as he opened his mouth to say something, as he took a step forward to intercept her, she reached the piano. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look back at the crowd for permission or approval. She simply turned, sat down on the bench, and placed her hands in her lap. The movement was so simple, so ordinary, yet it felt like a revolutionary act. The bench was cold and hard against her legs. She was so close to the piano now, she could feel its stillness, its immense potential. It was like sleeping giant, and she was the only one who knew how to wake it. The murmuring in the crowd grew louder. People were leaning forward, whispering to their neighbors, pointing. This was definitely not on the program. Was it a prank? A piece of strange, modern performance art? Julian stopped walking, his mouth still half open. He was frozen by the sheer audacity of it. She was just sitting there. A cleaner in a plain uniform, sitting at a $250,000 instrument, in the middle of a high society gala. The image was so absurd, so wrong, that for a moment he didn't know what to do. His confidence was a suit of armor, and a single tiny crack had just appeared. Alara took a deep breath. The air smelled of lilies and expensive perfume, but she closed her eyes and imagined a different smell. The dusty scent of her old bedroom, the faint odor of wax from the keyboard she used to polish religiously. She lifted her hands and hovered them over the keys just as she had done earlier. But this time, there was no hesitation. This time, she was not praying. She was preparing, and then it happened. A single note, clear, pure, and resonant. It cut through the noise of the crowd like a shard of glass. It wasn't loud, but it was so perfectly placed, so full of intention, that it silenced every whisper instantly. All heads turned to the stage. All eyes were fixed on her hands. Julian stood rooted to the spot, his anger replaced by a profound confusion. That single note hung in the air for a heartbeat. A moment of perfect, tense silence. And then her fingers descended. The music that erupted from the piano was not the simple, hesitant melody anyone might have expected. It was a torrent. A thundering, cascading wave of sound that filled the entire lobby, from the marble floor to the highest point of the chandeliers. It was a piece by Rachmaninoff, a composer known for his technical difficulty and emotional depth. A piece she had learned from a worn, second-hand music book she had found in a thrift store years ago. Her hands, which Julian had dismissed as functional, moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. The right hand danced across the higher keys, creating a shimmering, intricate melody that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. The left hand provided a powerful, rumbling foundation, a storm of sound that gave the music its immense power. The transformation in the room was immediate and absolute. The confused whispers died completely. The shifting in seats stopped. People who had been checking their phones or looking at their watches were now leaning forward, their mouths slightly agape, their eyes wide with disbelief. The music was not just background noise. It was a physical force. It demanded to be listened to. It was telling a story. Julian's world was tilting on its axis. The condescending sneer on his face had melted away, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. His jaw had gone slack. He, a man who considered himself an expert, who could tell the difference between a good and a great performance with a single listen, was hearing something he had no category for. This wasn't just good. This was extraordinary. It was technically flawless, yes, but it was more than that. It was filled with a raw, aching emotion that he had never heard from any of the famous, highly paid musicians he knew. Her playing wasn't just a display of skill. It was an act of confession. Every note was saturated with a feeling so deep and true, it felt like she was laying her soul bare for everyone to see. He looked at her hands again, really looked at them this time. They weren't the elegant, manicured hands of a concert pianist. They were strong, capable hands, with short nails and a few small scars. And yet they were coaxing sounds from this instrument that he could only dream of. The contradiction was staggering. The woman he had dismissed as a nobody, as a smudge on the perfect picture, was creating a masterpiece. His entire belief system, his neat little boxes for people, was shattering around him. He felt a strange, unfamiliar feeling rising in his chest. It was a mix of awe, humility, and a sharp, painful sting of shame. He had been so wrong. So arrogantly, completely wrong. Alara was no longer in the lobby. She was lost in the music. As her fingers flew across the keys, she was back in her small apartment, playing for her mother during the good days. When a smile would light up her tired face, she was playing through the grief of losing her, anger at the unfairness of it all, the loneliness of the years that followed. Every crescendo was a cry of frustration. Every delicate pianissimo passage was a whisper of a forgotten hope. The piano was her voice, and it was finally telling the story she had kept locked away for so long. She was not thinking about the crowd, about Julian, about her job. She was just playing. And in that moment, she was not a cleaner. She was not a nobody. She was a musician. And she was home. The last note hung in the air, shimmering and fragile, before it was swallowed by the silence. It wasn't an empty silence, but a full one, heavy with the weight of what everyone had just witnessed. The lobby of the Grand Royale, a place that was never quiet, was still. People were frozen in their seats, some with their glasses halfway to their lips, others leaning forward as if pulled by an invisible string. The air, which moments before had been buzzing with whispers and impatience, was now thick with a shared, unspoken emotion. It was awe. It was confusion. It was the collective sound of 100 people having their expectations completely shattered. On the bench, Lara's shoulders slumped. The adrenaline that had carried her through the piece was gone, and in its place was a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Her fingers ached, a sweet familiar pain she hadn't felt in years. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, not with fear anymore, but with the sheer force of the music she had just poured out of her. She slowly lifted her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap, her fingers trembling slightly. She kept her eyes closed, afraid to open them, afraid to see the faces, to see the judgment. She had done what she had to do. She had answered the desperate plea for anything. And now she just wanted to disappear, to melt back into the background where she belonged. The silence was her punishment, or maybe her salvation. She wasn't sure which. Then, from the back of the room came a single sound. It was the slow, deliberate clap of an older man, a retired music teacher who had been invited as a guest of a board member. It was a clap of recognition, of respect. It was one lone voice in the wilderness, but it was enough. It broke the spell. Another person joined in, then another and another. Within seconds, the single clap grew into a wave, a roar of applause that was so loud and so sudden it felt like a physical force. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a thundering, joyous, explosive sound. People were on their feet, their faces alight with a mixture of shock and delight. They were cheering, whistling, some were even wiping tears from their eyes. The standing ovation was for the mysterious woman in the cleaner's uniform. The woman who had just filled their gilded world with more soul and passion than they had ever experienced. Ilara's eyes flew open. The wall of sound hit her like a physical blow. She saw the sea of faces, all turned towards her, all smiling, all applauding her. A wave of panic washed over her, hot and overwhelming. This was not what she wanted. This was not her world. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like a secret that had been shouted from the rooftops. She quickly stood up, knocking the bench back slightly with a loud scrape. She wanted to run, to escape the stage, to get back to the safety of her cleaning cart and her quiet, invisible life. She gave a clumsy, jerky bow and turned to flee, but a figure was already moving up the aisle towards the stage. It was Julian Croft. He was not walking with his usual confident, predatory grace. He was moving almost mechanically, his body driven by a force he didn't understand. The sea of guests parted for him without a word. They all saw the look on his face, a look none of them had ever seen before. The arrogance was gone, the condescension had vanished. In its place was a raw, unguarded humility. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, or maybe a god. He reached the stage just as Ilara was about to step down. He didn't block her way, but he stopped her, holding up a hand not in command, but in a gentle plea. "Wait," he said. His voice was quiet, stripped of all its usual power. It was just a simple, human word. Ilara froze, her eyes wide with fear. She thought he was going to have her arrested. To publicly shame her for her audacity, Julian looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the fear in her eyes, the tear tracks on her cheeks, the way her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. He saw not a nobody, but a person who was terrified and brilliant and completely out of place. He felt a sharp, painful twist of guilt in his gut. The words he had whispered to his friend earlier, "People like that don't even know what to do with an instrument like that," code in his mind, and they felt like poison. "Who are you?" he asked again, but this time it was not a dismissal. It was a genuine, desperate question. It was the question of a man who realized the entire world he had built was on a shaky foundation, and this woman was the only one who could show him the truth by now. The frantic hotel manager, Mr. Allister, had rushed to the stage, followed by a few curious guests. A young man with a press pass around his neck was already scribbling in a notepad, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of a once-in-a-lifetime story. They formed a small semicircle around Ilara, a bubble of intense focus in the middle of the grand, echoing lobby, seeing that she was not in trouble, but the center of a strange, new kind of attention. Ilara's fear began to subside, replaced by a weary resignation. She took a shaky breath and started to speak, her voice barely a whisper at first. "My name is Ilara." She told them her story, and as she spoke, her voice grew stronger. She talked about the scholarship she had won to a prestigious music conservatory, the dream she had nurtured since she was a little girl. She talked about the call she had received, about her mother's sudden illness, about the choice she had to make. She didn't cry as she spoke of selling her beloved piano, the one thing in the world that was truly hers, to pay for her mother's care. She just stated it as a fact, a simple, painful sacrifice. She described the years that followed, the string of menial jobs, the long hours, the slow and quiet process of letting the dream die, of locking the music away in a corner of her heart until it almost stopped beating. As she spoke, the lobby grew quiet again. The applause had died down, and now all that could be heard was her voice, telling a story of a life lived in the shadows. Julian listened, his shame growing with every word. He thought of the effortless ease of his own life, of the opportunities he had been given and had taken for granted. He had looked at her uniform and seen a failure. He had seen her quietness and seen a lack of intelligence. He had seen her hovering over the piano and seen a pathetic fantasy. He had been blind. He had been looking at the cover of the book and had burned it without ever reading a single page. When she finished, there was another moment of silence. Mr. Allister. The manager looked at her with an expression of pure awe. The journalist was still scribbling furiously, already crafting the headline in his mind. The ghost of the Grand Royale. Hotel cleaner's performance stuns high society. Julian took a step closer. He didn't offer her money or a recording contract. He didn't try to fix anything. He just looked her in the eye and said, with a sincerity that surprised even himself, "Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us." It was a simple apology, an admission of his own ignorance, and a sign of respect, all rolled into one. In that moment, the powerful art patron and the humble cleaner were just two people, connected by a story and a piece of music that had changed everything. The nobody who had shocked everyone had finally been seen. 6 months can feel like a lifetime or a single, breathless moment. For Alara, it was both. The world she knew had been turned upside down and then gently set back on its feet, but on a completely different foundation. The story of the ghost of the Grand Royale, as the journalist had dubbed her, had spread like wildfire. For a few weeks, her face was everywhere, a symbol of hidden talent and unexpected grace. There were offers from record labels, television shows, and agents who promised to make her a star. It was a dizzying, terrifying whirlwind of attention. It's the exact opposite of the quiet, invisible life she had always cultivated. But through it all, it was one quiet, steady presence. Julian Croft. He didn't approach her with a contract or a camera crew. In the days following the gala, he had simply asked to meet her for coffee. They sat in a small, unassuming cafe, far from the gilded world of the Grand Royale. He didn't talk about business or marketing. He asked about her music. He asked about her mother. He listened, truly listened, with a humility that was so different from the man she had first seen in the lobby. He had learned his lesson, not just about her, but about himself. He saw now that his role wasn't to be a kingmaker, but a DoorDash opener. He used his influence not to create a spectacle, but to create an opportunity. He made a single, anonymous phone call to the director of the city's most prestigious music conservatory, the very one Alara had lost her scholarship 2 years ago. He didn't demand they accept her. He simply told her story, the real story, and asked if they would be willing to give her an audition. They did, and she played for them with a quiet confidence that stunned the panel. They didn't just offer her a place. They offered her a full scholarship funded by a benefactor who wished to remain anonymous. Julian had given her back the dream that had been stolen, not with a handout, but with a hand up. And so, on a cool autumn evening, the scene was not a grand hotel lobby, but a small, intimate recital hall inside the conservatory. The air was different here. It wasn't filled with the scent of money and champagne, but with the warm, woody smell of old instruments and the faint, dusty scent of sheet music. The seats were not gilded chairs, but simple velvet-cushioned benches, occupied not by socialites, but by students, teachers, and a few serious music lovers. The lighting was soft, focused on the single grand piano centered on the wooden stage. This was not a place for showing off. It was a place for the music itself. Julian Croft sat near the back. in a simple sweater and trousers, an outfit that would have made the old Julian shudder. He was not networking, not looking for people to impress. He was just another member of the audience, holding a simple program in his hands. He had come alone. He felt a strange sense of peace in this room, a feeling of being in the right place. He had spent a lifetime collecting art and patronizing artists. But he realized now that he had never truly felt a part of the creative process. He had always been on the outside looking in. Tonight, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. A quiet ripple of applause welcomed Alara to the stage. She walked out from the wings, and a few people in the audience who didn't know her story might have mistaken her for a student. She was wearing a simple dress of a deep blue color. Her hair was down, and her face was clear and bright. But there was a new grace in her posture, a quiet confidence in the way she carried herself. She was not the terrified woman who had fled the stage at the Grand Royale. She was not the invisible cleaner who had tried to disappear into the background. She was Alara the pianist. She sat at the bench, and the small hall fell into a hushed silence. She took a moment, her hands resting lightly on the keys, and looked out at the audience. Her eyes were not wide with fear, but calm and focused. She gave a small, shy smile, and then she began to play. The music that filled the room was not the same thundering, emotional storm she had unleashed that night at the hotel. This was different. It was a piece by Chopin, a nocturne, filled with a gentle, melancholic beauty. The notes were like moonlight on water, shimmering and delicate. There was still a deep well of emotion in her playing, but it was no longer the raw, desperate cry of pain. It was a more complex feeling, a mix of memory, hope, and a hard-won peace. Her fingers, which had once been rough from work, were now strong and sure, dancing across the keys with an effortless grace. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was having a conversation with them, telling a new story. It was the story of a woman who had been through the fire and had come out not burned, but forged stronger. Clearer, Julian listened, his eyes closed. He wasn't analyzing the technique or the structure of the piece. He was just feeling it. He could still remember the shock he had felt that night, the sting of shame that had followed. He remembered the way she had looked, so small and vulnerable, yet so incredibly brave. He thought about the phone call he had made. The quiet satisfaction of knowing he had helped, not for his own ego, but because it was the right thing to do. He understood now that the most beautiful things in life often come from the quietest places, from the people we are most likely to overlook. He had spent his life looking for masterpieces on gallery walls, not realizing that the greatest masterpiece is the human spirit, resilient and full of unexpected music. When the final soft chord faded into silence, the room was still for a heartbeat before it erupted into warm, genuine applause. It wasn't the explosive, shocked roar of the gala, but a deep, appreciative sound, the kind of applause that comes from people who truly understand what they have just heard. Alara stood and bowed, her smile no longer shy, but bright and full of a quiet joy. She looked out at the crowd, her eyes scanning the familiar faces of her teachers and classmates. And then her eyes found his. He was sitting near the back, in the shadows, but she saw him. Their eyes met across the small, intimate space. There were no words spoken. There didn't need to be. In his eyes, she saw a quiet, unwavering respect that was worth more than any standing ovation. It was an apology, an acknowledgement, and a celebration, all at once. In her eyes, he saw a deep, unspoken gratitude that went far beyond the scholarship. It was a thank you for seeing her, not as a project or a curiosity, but as a person. Slowly, deliberately, she gave him a single, small nod. He nodded back. It was a simple gesture, a tiny movement in a crowded room, but it was a conversation. It was the closing of a circle. It was the moment when the man who thought she was nobody and the woman who shocked everyone finally met on equal ground. As two people who shared a profound and life-changing experience, as the applause continued, Alara turned back to the piano. She placed her hand gently on the fallboard, her fingers resting on the smooth wood. She was no longer a ghost in a gilded lobby or a surprise sensation in a tabloid headline. She was a student, a musician, a woman who had found her way back home. And her home was not a place, but a feeling. It was the feeling of her fingers on the keys, the weight of a story waiting to be told, and the quiet, humbling knowledge that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected silence. The nobody was finally home, and her music was just beginning.